Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Good morning, everyone. It's a glorious, beautiful day. If only it was like this 24/7, I'd never complain about Texas. Alas, that is not reality. Okay. So this time around, semester around, we're going over the 6 Dharma gates to the Sublime. It is a text written by Zihi, or Chi'i. He is actually also the patriarch of our tradition, of the Tiantai tradition. And so he has written this document as a sort of meditation manual of some sort. There is another document that's an actual manual, so but I thought I would start with this one first since it covers more of the basics than the actual manual that he has written. So last class we just went over all of them very generally, but we'll stick with one at a time for each class. So today we'll start with the first one, which is counting. And then we'll just go down the list. So the sublimes are meant to help us guide ourselves and figure out where we are at in our meditation practice. So during the Buddhist time, meditation practice was already very common and was already practiced among most of the people. So the Buddha never set down specific instructions to meditate because he didn't want to repeat himself for something that people already knew how to do. So we have very little literature from the Buddha about how to actually meditate. The 2 common literatures that we have, the discourses that we have, is the Anapanasati Sutra, the mindfulness of breathing, and the Satipatthana Sutra, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So those are the 2 core Buddhist meditation texts that we have. And in the past, we've gone over the Anapanasati Sutra, which has the 16 exercises of breathing, which is actually part of the second sublime of following. So we'll go through those 16 exercises. In the past, I believe we only went through the first 4 exercises because those are the ones directly used, directly mentioning or utilizing the breath as we breathe in and out. So we won't go through all of 16 in detail in next class. I may split it up into 2 classes, but in this teaching specifically, it's asked that we memorize the 16 practices because we need to know where we are at and how we are following the breath through the 16 exercises. And once we get mastered enough in the 16 and knowing that the 16 no longer apply to our practice, we have that indication of now is the time of letting it go and moving on to the next one. So in most meditation practices, especially if you're well practiced and you're doing more advanced techniques or advanced meditations, specifically the absorptions or the dhyanas, the 4 jhanas, or dhyanas is correct too. If we were to achieve or attempt to achieve the 4 jhanas, which is these higher states of consciousness, it is possible to attain them by just mastering the first sublime, which is counting. However, it's not necessary that we reach that. This is going to happen for sure for everyone. So don't get discouraged if no aha moments happen or you have not attained any of the absorptions. But the point is there are strict rules when we're following these sublime truths, but these sublime practices, that we have to use them, utilize them, and kind of pretty much go down the list, right? Well, not go down the list, but Chi specifically mentions that each one has to have we have to cultivate and realize each sublime before we can move on to the next. Meaning it has to be mastered to such a degree that when we are counting, we're counting with no effort, right? We're not exerting any energy, we're not forcing the count to happen. It just comes naturally and it comes without effort. And then once it's cultivated and realized, and it happens without efforts, then it's going to start to become a course practice, a method. It's going to become coarse and almost to the state of being boring or useless because it's no longer benefiting you. That's the point where we can recognize that this practice no longer works for us, and we've hopefully at that degree mastered it to such a degree that we can acknowledge that it is done and we can move on to the next sublime. So the key point there is recognizing that when we're in each sublime, as long as we can practice and follow the steps and the techniques for each one without any efforts, that's the key word here, right? Because at first, you're going to have to put a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a lot of dedication into calming the mind and paying attention to your object of meditation. But eventually, after much practice, it'll come naturally. It's going to happen without any effort. Meaning that when you're counting, and if a distraction arises or a thought arises, usually we have to shift our attention from our object of meditation to that distraction in order to acknowledge it and release it and let it go so that we can go back to our object of meditation, right? But after some time, after we've mastered or semi-mastered the technique, if we're counting and a distraction arises, we can acknowledge it and see it and let it go without shifting our attention at all. So the counting still happens without any effort. That's what it's meaning here. And so today I'm going to go over 3 methods of counting. I added 2 more of my own accord because I feel like they're beneficial. And they've helped me tremendously through my practice in the past. So for counting, it's literally self-describing. You're counting. So as we're meditating, well, let me backtrack a little bit. For any and all of the sublimes, for any method or technique that we use that has to do with the breath is the object of meditation. However, the spot of meditation, the location of the object of meditation is going to be at the anapana spot, which is this little spot on top of your upper lip below your nostrils. This is called the anapana spot. And so our attention is going to be always on this anapana spot. As we're counting, or as we're breathing, or as we're following the breath, whatever method we're using, this is where we're focusing our attention while supporting the breath. So as we're practicing and meditating at the anapana spot, and we're now counting, you're simply counting for every in-breath and out-breath, that's 1. In-breath, out-breath, 2. In-breath, out-breath, 3, up until 10. And then we just repeat the process. At any time during that count, if we have lost count, if we've gotten distracted, if anything, any emotion or feeling or anything that arose that had distracted us from the counting, we're going to reset and go back to 1. After some time, if you've managed to go through 1 through 10 at least a few times without any distraction or restarting, you can add an extra oomph of spice to that. And once you reach 10, you can count backward from 10 to 1. That's an extra challenge. Whenever we're doing something out of normal routine, right? Even though it's simple to count back from 10 to 1, it's still something different, and it's a challenge to the mind regardless. And so I would give yourself no less than 10 times if you've managed to count 1 to 10 without any distraction or loss or reset. If you're able to do that at least 10 times consecutively, then you can start doing it backward and see how that works. And see if you can tell a difference. Or do one full session of counting from 1 to 10 normally, and have another session counting 1 to 10 for a few times, and then adding the backward count to that. That way you can kind of compare your mentality, you can compare your mental state of those two sessions to see which one worked better. Because honestly, when we're doing any type of meditation method or technique, you want to experiment with different ways of meditating, because not one way is going to work for everybody. It's not a one-size-fits-all, right? And so you have to find what works for you best and stick to that method. So if counting 1 to 10 works for you the most, or the best, do it. If counting backward works the best, do it. If doing any other method or technique that I go over that or you know of, stick to it. And you stick to it until it no longer works. Don't stick to it just for a day or two or a week or a month. You stick to it until it no longer works. That's it. That's the exception. The second method of counting, which isn't really counting, but it's more, I call it following, but it doesn't fall under the, it technically does fall under the category of following as well, but I'm still going to add it to counting because it's still beneficial. Because what we're trying to establish at this first Sublime is stabilizing the mind to such a degree where we can hopefully attempt to enter the state of mind called access concentration, which is the doorway to the 4 jhanas, or 8 jhanas, right? Access concentration is the correct state of mind of meditation that we need to be in. But anyway, so the second method is literally following the breath as you breathe in. So we're going to focus on specific spots in the body as we breathe. So we'll start out at the nostrils. So you're going to shift your attention from the Anapana spot to your nostrils. You're going to feel the breath enter and exit your nose as you breathe in. And you're going to focus your entire attention there where you have to feel the breath. You want to feel the air, right? And make subtle notations like, is the air cold? Is it warm? Is your breath slow? Is it fast? Is it shallow? Is it coarse? Is it smooth, right? Find this one word label that you can label it to and stick to it until it changes, right? Because our breath changes depending on our state of mind and depending on our physicality. So if you were walking outside for an hour and you came in, your breath is going to be unstable. You sit down and your breathing is a little bit, it's fast, it's coarse, because you've been doing all this physical activity. So the body needs time to slow down. And as the body slows down and the mind slows down, the breath slows down. And so there's this change there. And so we want to recognize that change. Or if you're sitting in a distraction of anger arises or frustration, the breath is going to recognize, the body's going to recognize that, and the breath is going to start to be deeper or more coarse or less subtle. And so you want to recognize that shift and that change of how you're breathing. It's going to be sometimes it'll be very subtle. Maybe it'll be like a fraction of a second longer or shorter, but that change is what you want to recognize. Because if you can recognize those changes and recognize when it changes, how it changes, and why it changed, you're strengthening your practice. It's not just recognizing that, oh, my breath has changed, now it's longer or shorter. Sure, that's one accomplishment. Another accomplishment is recognizing why it happened in the first place, right? And this can turn into a bigger meditation, but you don't want to go into too much details as to why it arose. You still want to label it. So it's anger, just label as anger. Maybe you've remembered something that that someone said to you or something that happened that frustrated you or angered you, and it's coming back as a distraction. You're simply just going to acknowledge whatever feeling arose that caused your breath to shift or change, whether it's anger, frustration, sadness, happiness, whatever it is. Give it that label, and then go back to your breath and let it stabilize again. So anyway, you're going to start out at the nostrils. You're going to feel the breath go in and out, right? Acknowledge. You're just going to breathe normally. Even when we're counting ones and twos and threes, what often happens for most people is as they're breathing, they're controlling the breath and they're controlling the counting, right? So you're forcing yourself to breathe, to count. You're forcing the inhale and the exhale, right? And you don't want to do that. You're not controlling the breath. You're simply watching the breath. You're observing the breath. So a good rule of thumb is don't count before or as the breath is happening, or when it first happens. Breathe in, and mid-breath, inhale or mid-exhale, that's where you count. That way you're not controlling the breath, because typically when you're controlling it, you're numbering it as it's happening, the second it's happening. That's not what you want to do. So in order to avoid that and escape that potential control of the breathing, breathe normally, and mid-breath, inhale or exhale, then do the counting. So anyway, back to the nostrils. So you're going to breathe in at least the minimum of 3 times. So breathe in, breathe out, and just acknowledge and be aware of the breath as it's entering your nose, right? You want to feel the breath there. After at least 3 breaths or more, then you're going to shift your attention to the back of your throat. Feel the air kind of go in and out. You want to literally, again, notice, is it cold, is it warm, is it subtle, can you feel it, can you not feel it? And you do that for another 3 to 5 breaths and shift more down to kind of like the neck area. Feel the air in and out, 3 to 5 times. Then shift it to your lungs. Feel your chest and lungs expand and contract. Feel the air go in and out as you're breathing. You do that also for 3 to 5 times. Lastly, you're going to feel your whole body get absorbed with the air, get absorbed with the breath, right? Because the breath, oxygen doesn't just go to our lungs. It goes through our bloodstream and all that. So our whole body gets oxygen. So you want to feel the whole body get energized and refreshed with oxygen. And you do that again for 3 to 5 times. And then you just reverse the order. So go from the whole body to the lungs, to the neck, back to the throat, to the nose, and back in and out again. So that's the repetition that you do. That works very well for most people because it's not a single place that we're focusing. Because if you just stick to like the Anapana spot, so when we're doing like a really long, deep meditation session, your only object of meditation is the Anapana spot. Nothing else, no more, no less. Your entire session, for whether it's an hour or more, it's only focusing on this. And so it becomes very difficult because most people are going to get distracted a bazillion times, right? But the reason why the second method of breathing works is because you're shifting attention to different places and different spots in the body. It's not sticking to just one spot. So the mind doesn't get bored for staying in one spot. You're shifting the attention around. And so your attention, your awareness becomes more active, right? And it's not just settling on one spot. So it's much easier to maintain focus that way. The third and final step that I want to mention is a method I created called the +1 method. And I typically do this with either like a ticking clock or a metronome or something, because I use the sound of the ticks to do this. But you can use your breath in this case. And the way that we do this, so I always find it hard to explain, even though I've made this up. We're counting, but as you're counting for each breath or each tick of the clock or metronome, you're adding a number. So if you're breathing in, that's 1. Breathe out, 1. Breathe in, 2. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? So you're for each breath, you're just repeating, but adding a number. Does that make sense? Think, right? So I'm gonna restart. So you're breathing in, that's 1. You're breathing out, in and out, right? 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, up until 10. And then you reverse. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 1, 9, 8, 7, 6, 4, 5, 1, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 1. That's not correct. But you know what I mean. So you're doing it forward and you're doing it backward. This is the most challenging because you really have to pay attention. There's no room for distraction here. The slightest distraction, you'll either, 1, continue on beyond where you're supposed to stop and reset, or you'll forget where you left off at, right? And so in either situation, you're going to have to repeat the whole process again. So it's the most challenging, but it's also the most effective, and that works for me the best, especially during a long sit. The only time I do that, because it does take time, at least for me, I have to do that I've managed to do that up to 30 and back. And that gives me about 20 to 30 minutes of meditation. And then that's enough time for me to get in the zone where I can sit for another hour or 2. Right? So I do that in our morning meditations, which is our longest sit of the day. But I invite you to experiment with all methods and see what works for you best. The last method is tricky, it's challenging, but it's very, very effective. The second method, less challenging, but also equally effective. Again, the reason why the second and the third method works is because, again, instead of just focusing on one thing or one spot or one area, you're doing multiple things at a time in a mindful way. This isn't multitasking, this is multi-meditating. I don't know. I'll make up a word next time. But it becomes effective because of that. And so that allows the mind to still be focused and concentrated, but you're just having small chunks of concentration at a time versus one giant chunk. Because if you just sit and meditate, just to sit and meditate and trying to focus on the Anapana spot, that's just one big chunk. And you have so much room for error and so much room for distraction. But if we break it down into smaller concentration chunks, then there's less room for error, less room for distraction, because there's movement, right? There's mindful movement. So it becomes easier to sit for a meditation with less distraction. But if and when distraction arises, because it will arise, we simply want to just acknowledge that distraction, give it that label, and we go back to our object of meditation. The label doesn't have to be anything fancy or complicated. It's just the first thing that arises if something happens. If you're sitting in meditation and the door opens, simply acknowledge sound or door, right? Tell it as it is. Oftentimes, what may happen is if the door opens and you're in the middle of meditation, your mind might start to entertain itself and ask itself, oh, who is that? Why are they here? Why are they late? Why are they distracting me from my meditation? Right? And you're asking all these questions. You're making up this entire story. You're making up this entire movie in your mind for something that's simply just sound or the door opening. And so because all that extra information is false, it's not actual reality, why are we poisoning our mind with that, right? So instead of creating this false reality of the story you're telling yourself, acknowledge that reality and give that simple label of door or sound, because that is reality. That is what is happening. And that is the only fact that you know of what has occurred when the door has opened. That the door has opened and there's sound. That's it. You don't know anything else, so don't make it up. Don't entertain yourself that way. It's not important. But we do that all the time, right? When we're driving down the road, we see an accident, we always make up a story of how it caused, what caused it, who's involved, why are they involved. We're making up stuff all the time for just pure stupid entertainment. It's useless. It's useless information. But instead, if you see the accident, you simply, just like the door, acknowledge accident or emergency or danger, whatever it is, whatever comes to your mind. Just give it that simple one-word label and move on. And as you do that, because again, the mind, we're not the masters of our mind. You don't have control over your mind, unfortunately, not yet. Because if you did, you would be able at will to stop all your thinking, to stop all your distractions. You'd be able to do exactly what you want to do, but we can't, because we do not have full control over it. And because we don't have full control over it, when we are trying to meditate and be present and focus on our breath or object of meditation, the mind is obsessed with time. It's obsessed with the past and it's obsessed with the future. And because of that, it's like, oh, we're meditating now? We're trying to focus on the present? I don't like that. Let's think about that argument we had with our husband or wife 2 years ago. Let's bring that emotions back up, right? Let's bring up the chaos and the drama from work from last week. Or let's think of the future, right? Maybe you're thinking about what do you want to have for lunch today, or what you need to buy from the grocery store, or what you need to do next week for work or school or whatever it is. It's obsessed with the past and obsessed with the future because those are the only two things that the mind can control. It cannot control the present because the present is present. Nothing's happening. Nothing has happened. Nothing will happen. And so because it doesn't have control over that, it's trying to take you away from it because you have control over that. And so when people get distracted, and they get distracted often, especially if you're new to meditation or newer to meditation, people get so discouraged because they just think that I can't do this. My mind just keeps wandering. My mind is there's so much thinking, there's so much thought going on. Yeah, and that's exactly what the mind is supposed to do. It's its job. The object of meditation, in the long run, yes, it is to have a clear mind of no thinking, no thoughts, no distractions. But for now, until you are masters of meditation, the object isn't to stop thinking. There's no point of stopping thinking because the mind, you can't control that, right? So when people come to me and say, oh, I can't stop thinking, I'm like, well, who told you to stop thinking? I never told you to stop thinking. That's not the point here. The point is to know that you're thinking, because thinking and distractions arising isn't necessarily a bad thing. What's bad is if you do not recognize it happening and you just let it go passively. So if a distraction arises and you start to entertain it and you start to give it ideas and perceptions and thoughts and feelings, you've lost. But if a distraction arises, and even if it's for a few seconds, maybe it's a few minutes, maybe it's the whole meditation session, but as long as you've recognized that a distraction has arose and caused a distraction, you've done exactly what you need to be doing. Whether it takes you a few seconds, minutes, or the whole session, it doesn't matter. But as long as you've recognized that distraction arising, and you've caught it, and you've labeled it, and you went back to your object of meditation, you've 100% did what you're supposed to do. But if you never did, and if you allowed that distraction to take over, and you start to entertain it, and give it movies and subtitles, and characters, and plots and twists, you failed. We failed. So it doesn't matter how long the distraction is. It doesn't matter how many times distractions arise. As long as you've caught each one, you've done exactly what you need to do. You are becoming a Zen master. So don't think to sit in meditation means to not think and have zero thoughts and have a completely clear mind. That's not going to happen. Not anytime soon, at least. So until then, embrace the distractions, but acknowledge them, recognize them, see them for what they are, as just impermanent distractions, and let it go. Because as soon as you recognize and acknowledge a distraction, it's already going to be like, okay, you caught me. And so it'll naturally just disappear on its own the moment you recognize it. and then you can go back to your object of meditation. Eventually, when we do this long enough and repeat it long enough, the mind will start to reprogram itself. It'll start to recognize that, okay, meditation is a time of silence and clarity and peacefulness, whatever, right? And so the mind will start to recognize that pattern, and it'll start to reprogram itself. It'll start to rewire new brain cells to recognize that meditation means quiet time, right? We have to treat our mind like a child. You gotta go time out because you did something bad, right? So likewise, our mind has to take a time out because it's distracting us too much. So it takes a lot of practice, takes a lot of time, but it will work. It will get better. Your mind will start to truly do what you want it to do. You'll take back some of that control. And those changes and those improvements will be very subtle in most cases, right? It'll be subtle to such a degree that you may not even recognize that any change or improvement has happened, right? And that's the big challenge for most meditators. Because again, if you go back to the Buddhist time and the two main meditation discourses, they're not really instructions if we kind of boil it down, right? They're kind of instructions, but they're not really true instructions. And so there's no literature saying or telling us exactly where we're at in our meditation, how to recognize improvement or how to recognize realization. There's none of that, really. So it becomes very difficult for meditators to kind of gauge where they're at in their practice. But this is where the Sublimes come into place, and this is where Chi's instructions, meditation manual instruction comes in place, because it does give those detailed instructions and to help you recognize where we're at in our meditation. So it gives us he'll give us specific instructions and steps to follow. And he'll say, do this for so much time until this specific thing has happened, or this specific thing has arose or realized. Then you know you've mastered this set of instructions and you can move on to the next, right? It's that specific. And because it's that specific, it does help improve our practice, because now we can for sure gauge where we're at and how we're doing. Versus if we just follow these 16 practices in the Anapanasati Sutra, there's no way for us to gauge where we're at. 0 instructions. So it becomes very difficult for most people. And so luckily we have text like the Sublime and the counterpart, the instruction manual as well, to help us. And it's one of very, very few texts out there written by enlightened beings that give such specific, extremely helpful instructions. So we are grateful to have them exist to help us. And so as we go through this list of the Sublimes, again, for counting, for all of them, one of the instructions to recognize its semi-mastery or its full mastery is, again, by doing these practices without any effort. So the counting and not being distracted and sticking with the count without shifting your attention means we've either semi or mastered enough where we can move on to the next. And of course, I don't expect us to master each one every 2 weeks for the classes. I'm not going to make a big deal of that, but we'll still go through each Sublime because it's going to be important for your own practice. So in the future, when you do become realized in each category, each section, you know where you're at and you can kind of gauge yourself, whether you need to stick to it longer, or maybe you need to backtrack and revisit prior practices, or you know it's time to move on to the next. But knowing that engaging that is going to become very helpful. It's going to become very encouraging. Because even for myself, back in the early days, I didn't know about this text until I became a monk. So for the past 15 years before I became a monk, when I was meditating, I was just hoping for the best. And sure, I've gone pretty deep and advanced in my meditation, but if I had these instructions early on, I probably would have progressed much quicker than I had been. And so as we practice the counting, so either, I'm going to stop talking soon so we can have a full 30 minutes of sitting, but it may not be enough time for you to switch through each of the 3 methods I just gave you, so pick one when we do our sitting and stick with it for the whole time, whole sit. That should be enough. The 20 to 30 minutes of sitting should be enough time to stick with one full method. But I do encourage you to try all 3. There are so many other more methods for breathing and counting, but those are the 3, in my experience, the most helpful and the most beneficial. So definitely try each one. The third method, the +1 method, I would allow yourself no less than 30 to 45 minutes to try the third method. Because if you make it up to 10 and back, that's about, depending if you're using your breath or the clock or a metronome, depending on what method you use, it can take anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. So that's also a good way to kind of give yourself a countdown, timer of how long you've been meditating. And so if you do the third method from up to 10 and 1, and you stop, you can see how long that took you, right? That way in the future, if you want to set up a specific time to sit or meditate, you know how many times you have to do that in order to sit for that period. Again, when I do 30, assuming I have no distractions, there's a clock in that room, so I utilize the clock that's there. What will happen, and one way to also gauge your concentration, or how well the concentration is going, is by observing the breath. Eventually, after your mind and body has settled, your breathing will also become very subtle as well. It'll be very shallow and slow to such a degree that it may even feel like you've stopped breathing altogether. Which, of course, you haven't, because otherwise you'd not be alive, right? So, if that recognition arises in you, that where you feel like, oh my God, I don't think I'm breathing, right? Most people will freak out and take that deep inhale and make that big sigh. You don't want to do that, right? Because that'll actually reset your concentration. It'll literally put a stop into that progress that you've just made and reset itself. So don't freak out if you feel like you've stopped breathing. Your body knows what to do. It is breathing. It's not going to stop breathing for you, right? It's not going to not take care of you. The body knows what it's doing. So if you've noticed and you've had maybe either a semi-freak out, you're totally freaking out, instead of taking that big sigh or that deep breath, just shift your attention to something else momentarily until that feeling has passed, and then just go back to your object, to your breath. And you can shift your attention to literally anything else, whether it's shifting your attention to a different part of the body, or maybe there's a background sound going on, you can shift your attention back to the sound, or anything else. Anything that you can focus on for 10 to 15 seconds. literally that short. It doesn't have to be a very long time, just very momentarily, until that feeling of discomfort of not breathing goes away, and then just go back to your breath. But that is a good sign that you're in a good state of concentration. It is that very subtle breathing, to the point where you may not feel like you're breathing at all. It's actually a good sign. Don't worry, you're not breathing, okay? Your body won't abandon you like that. But it is a very good sign that you're in a pretty good concentration. For counting, that may be, well, for any of the sublimes, the breathing piece is, regardless of what meditation method or practice you're using, the subtle breathing is always a good sign of good concentration. But anyway, as we progress in the counting, regardless of what method we're using, again, when it arises, or when it happens without effort, right? And when I say without effort, that means that when you are meditating and you're following your breath, or you're doing what you're doing, and a distraction arises, that the distraction doesn't take you away from your object of meditation, right? Because in the beginning, what we want to do when a distraction arises is to acknowledge the distraction, give it that label, and let it go away so we can go back to our object of meditation, right? But after a while, when a distraction arises, it's not strong enough for us to need to shift our attention away from the breath to that distraction, to acknowledge it, label it, and go back to the object of meditation, right? Our concentration would become strong enough where we don't need to make that shift. Where we can just simply acknowledge it in the background, see it for what it is as a distraction, and it'll just go away on its own without having to leave your object. And so when we get to that point, and to the point of the not breathing, then we know that we're in a really good concentration state of mind. Maybe to the point that you're in an axis concentration, which is exactly the mindset that we need to be in for correct meditation. And those two signs, the shallow, low breath and the without effort, right, without the shifting of the attention, once we've achieved those two checkpoints, we know that will be your sign to know that you can now move to the next level. There are other more specific signs and instructions, but we won't go through those specifics. But those two will be good enough for us to be able to move from counting to following. And then same thing happens with the following. We do it to such a degree where we do it without effort, without shifting our attention. And when we get to that degree, then we can shift next to the third sublime, stabilization, and so on and so forth. But those two will, for now, be your two indicators of this is good enough to move on, I guess. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now so we have time to meditate. Any questions, concerns, emotional outbursts? Yes.
Could you repeat the parts of the body for the second step?
The nose, back of your throat, down your neck, chest, lungs, and full body. And then back up again. Any other questions? Okay. We will actually have time for a full 30 minutes today. I'm very excited. Well, we'll see about that. But feel free to stretch if you need to.